We're glad to have you with us for Tartan Truths with Peter MacDonald, and he has joined us again this week. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Great pleasure.
You shared an sort of an eye-opening discovery about the Angus tartan found in 1880. Many of us have a perspective on that tartan, but what you're sort of revealing is that maybe our understanding of that tartan is incorrect. Can you explain a little bit about that for
Yeah,
us?
yeah. And that would be my understanding up until a week ago as well, insofar as many of us will be familiar with the Angus tartan. If I said it was a black and blue tartan with red over stripes, that pretty much sums it up. Um, and it was, as far as we know, in all the records, cited the first known example as a specimen in what's called the Clans Originaux, which was although it describes as a book, actually, it's a book of weavers or manufacturers. It's like a sample book, actually, of patterns. I was doing some work, a design project for someone, and using the Angus as an element of that design work in referencing their name, etc. And so I thought, well, let's go back to first principles. Let's go back and I'll just check that. So I was looking at the pattern for the original oldest version known of the proportions. So, how the stripes relate to each other, etc. So I was just checking that. The sample is very, very dark, what we would now think of as modern colors. So this is an 1880 sample, very, very, very dark. So the blue is almost, it's a very dark navy, like an ultramarine blue. So its transition from the blue to black is quite hard to see. So took a photograph of it. I've been fortunate to have access to the whole of the collection and photographed it. And then I took the photograph and I basically lightened it, the whole thing, so that I could determine the changes, etc. And on doing that, I noticed that so on the black square, on the black ground, there are two stripes of red. But when I lightened it, it was very obvious that the color in the middle of the two stripes of red was not black, as was always assumed, but was in fact the same blue. So it immediately made the pattern a little more complex, but much more interesting. It gave it a much more of a harmony or a balance, if you like. So all of a sudden, everything we thought we knew about the Angus tartan in terms of design is wrong. So unlucky, if you like, for everybody else who now wears it, that everything that the manufacturers currently produce and have produced since 1906, when this version, so the 1880 piece presumably was used as a source for a publication in 1906, where the black, the two stripes on the black first appears. And from there on, that's how the manufacturers have always woven it. And it's just a really fascinating discovery, one of those things that, just by pure accident, one often comes across. And so history is always a bit like science, correcting or changing what we know. And it's only as good as the latest information.
Yeah, that's very true. So if everybody recognizes this is correct, which obviously it is, what does the weaver have to do or what does anybody have to do really to make it commercially available? Do they have to require like a new registration or they
So
just
it
get it?
wouldn't need a new registration so much. So I would now, and certainly with my Tartans Authority hat on, I have added in a second entry under Angus.
Okay.
So I've got the 1880 version and the 1906 version. So the 1906 version, we're going back well over 100 years now, so as old as some what we think of as clan or sett tartans. But it is correct in that sense, but it is not correct in terms of the historical precedents. If manufacturers wanted to go back to that version, it's quite easy for them to do so. They would just have to, either change their stock or run it as an additional one. The very smart manufacturer might say, you know what, we're now going to stop the version we did do and offer the correct version. And the first person that gets on that market will probably have a market. But,
Yes.
because they have, as we would say in Scotland, this I-bean, and that's how they have always woven it, trying to get the manufacturers to change not only patterns but also colours can be quite a long process. And for them, ultimately, they have to decide whether it's a commercial undertaking, because everybody thinks that's what it is, and every book, and just because MacDonald says it's wrong, and I can prove it, doesn't make it necessarily commercially available or viable until and unless it's then promoted as such.
Isn't it
The best way
expensive?
to do it would be to do a short run So if there were a group of Anguses that were interested, or I don't even know that, no, I don't think they have a chief, but even so, if there were a group that were interested, then to do a short run and start promoting it. And then, maybe one of the major manufacturers would say, oh, hang on, there's potential in this, or let's go back to the original version. And that would be, a great thing to see.
Is it expensive to change that then, do you think?
It's not expensive. It's only as expensive as having a special weave done. And obviously, the more you do, the cheaper it gets. In terms of the weavers, anyone was wanting to offer it for stock, particularly if they wanted to take the other one out, which would probably be the sensible thing to do to avoid confusion. It would simply mean them then obviously waiting until the stocks run out and changing their um, online and any other imagery that they have that supports the older version and just replacing it with the current version, replacing it with the original or older version.
Yeah, it seems like they would actually drive up that market for the inaccurate version to get rid of it. People would be like, "Hey, this is
Yep.
my last chance to get that tartan that we've always
Well,
had."
they might do that, or they might go, you know what, I don't want that one because I know the proper one's coming somewhere down the road.
True, true. Are there any other tartans that are widely accepted? Because we talked about colors a lot, and I'm sure throughout all this podcast, it's always going to be something about the colors and sort of the patterns and the changes over the years. Is there any other tartans that are widely accepted, but they actually differ from maybe original specimens, waiting for
Um,
things to get
yeah,
rediscovered like
there
this?
are, and there are actually quite a lot, and particularly some of the older pieces. You see how they have changed over time, and some of the more recent work I've done. So, for example, the Genesis collection with House of Edgar, trying to recreate some of those older patterns back as they, match the original pieces. But I'll give you a primary example, which would be the MacDonald Glen, MacDonald Kingsborough, so called, which is when you see it commercially, normally it is a green and red based tartan with a triple yellow stripe on it. Well, if you go to the original piece, you'll realize that the yellow stripes are in fact a pale green.
Hmm.
So that the coloration and indeed the proportions of that pattern are not true to the original surviving specimen. And I've actually had it reconstructed in the past, but there's another one that commercially is still offered in this case, 1893 version that comes from a book that incorrectly replicated it. And this is what we often see, some of these, what we think of as older traditional patterns, the interpretation by them, by previous individuals, as, if you like, set the groundwork, but set the groundwork wrong.
And
No,
have you had anybody from that clan reach out to you about
not
this?
yet. No, 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 not yet.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting, as I say. I mean, I'd very much like to work with someone if they were interested in getting a length done, because it would be great to see it out there um,
Yeah.
and promoted. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see where that goes.
So we're going to talk about this week your holy grail, and that is Black Watch, but not just any Black Watch tartan.
So, my tartan holy grail, as opposed to some other holy grail in life, um, but the Black Watch, synonymous with Scotland, synonymous with military tartans, etc. Um, possibly along with the Royal Stewart, equally, the two most popular tartans in the world. Historically speaking, they've been produced on biscuit tins and cloth and all sorts of things for hundreds of years, certainly, and very, very popular. Um, Black Watch, so called, although it was never called that originally. It was the tartan for the 42nd Regiment. Actually, originally, it possibly was the tartan for the 43rd Regiment, who later were renumbered, and only later became called Black Watch because of the association with the regiment. That tartan, which is also sometimes referred to as government tartan, because it was used by a number of other regiments as well. So the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders used it, the 87th stroke 88th Keith Highlanders used it, the 78th Fraser Highlanders used it, so they didn't wear the red one, but people think they did, and a number of others as well. So very, very popular tartan. But even as the association with the Black Watch, and if you like, a couple of other regiments early on, I've calculated that between the founding of the regiment, which was in 1739, and the end of the American War of Independence, which is where we then go into sort of much more commercialization of production. Between that period, and I think that the earliest date for the actual tartan may be slightly later than the regiment's formation. It might be as late as 1745 or something like that. But that early part of the midsection of the 18th century, between then and the American War of Independence, I've calculated that something like 40 miles of this tartan was woven. 40 miles. That's, you get in a car and drive that, that's quite a lot of tartan. Not one piece is known to survive, which I find just extraordinary. Now, we all know that clothing was reused, etc., till it fell apart. It was a campaign clothing, so blah, 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 blah. But I am absolutely certain, particularly because a number of members of various regiments, so the 42nd Black Watch, the 78th Fraser Highlanders, settled in North America. They were given land grants, etc., settled. Many of them will have retained their original plaids. I cannot believe that somewhere in the northern US, or more likely Canada on the East Coast, somewhere in Mrs. McClumpher's chest somewhere is a piece of tartan that they may not recognize, or it may just be some fragment somewhere, that there is a piece of the original Black Watch tartan. And that would be so cool to find. I've talked about it being arguably the most popular tartan in the world, how much was woven before 1780. The oldest piece I know to survive is about 1795. And it's a piece of Wilson's of Bannockburn's cloth, and it's associated with the Strathspey Fencibles. I mean, it was found in a knapsack. They were a short-lived regiment, so we can sort of date it to about that period. So as I say, finding that would just be absolutely remarkable. We've got references to it. We can find the orders for it for both individuals and the regiment, but not have one piece that survives is just a phenomenal thing. And as I say, I find it hard to believe. And if I can do one thing before I die, it would be find a piece of that.
Yeah, definitely. So
and recreate it, of
and
course.
recreate it. So we'll post the one that you found. You had posted it back in Facebook a while back. We'll post that on the Instagram page, and with our show notes. This one from roughly 1795.
Mm.
But what would be the difference of this from 1795 in your mind to what they might have had 50 years
So,
before that?
yeah, so there are a couple of things. Obviously, well, not obviously, but the weight of the cloth would probably be different. Depending on how much of the cloth there is. I mean, to find a full width piece would be, that really would be cherries on the top. So the colours will be the same, i.e. red, blue, green, but it will be the shades of those colours. And yes, there may be some fading, but it's particularly the shade of green, which I would expect to be a more olivey shade at that period. And the blue, I would expect to be a mid-navy rather than the very, very dark colour that people associate with the Black Watch today. And the other thing which would be fantastic would be to be able to find the, if you like, the bottom section, a piece that had the bottom section, i.e. the selvage, because there are references to the selvage being a selvage mark and what they call tweels. So that's possibly herringboned or possibly even chevroned as well.
Mm.
Those two. So finding those pieces would help in that reconstruction. So we know what width the cloth was woven at. We've got some idea with the surviving piece from the 64th Regiment. So that was Loudon's Highlanders, which is a blue, green, and black tartan with a yellow and red overstripe. But with that has the selvage mark on it, so it gives you an indication of what it may have looked like. Interestingly, that tartan, which is 1747, 7, is very, very dark. So it's what we would call modern colours nowadays. So that just suddenly throws that other spanner in the work. It's atypical of tartans of that period. So whilst one is assuming that the early Black Watch tartan was lighter than was woven latterly, it might not have been the case.
Hmm.
We also know, I should say, that when the companies were being regimented to form the regiment in 1739, plaids for certainly the grant companies, so there's the 3 grant companies and possibly the Monroe Company, so those up from Inverness, They were all woven along Speyside, and we've got a list of the 100 weavers that were employed to weave the plaids for those companies. The idea that there would have been an exact uniformity of shade, it just doesn't be, because there's so many dye lots that would have been required for that. But again, it would just be fascinating to know. We get a slight insight. Again, you've got the earliest reliable portrait is 1756, Campbell of Melfort. And again, it shows something in what we might now call mid-tones, more like something like muted colours. So that is, as at the moment, that is my Tartan Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Until something more important comes up.
How accurate are the portraits for you sometimes? Seems like a lot of times they're portrayed darker
Yeah.
as far as getting a real feel on what it might have been that
So
early.
you've got a couple of things there. So and the classic one would be, I don't know if you know the portrait by Delacroix of called The Pinch of Snuff, which is almost certainly Fraser of Furness, who was a 78th Highlander. And people say, oh, well, look, this tartan looks like that. There's another very famous one of the Earl of Eglinton, who was in charge of the Montgomery Highlanders, 77th, who also wore the government stroke black watch tartan. And when you look at that, you've got to understand that, first of all, an artist is working with paints that he has generally mixed up himself to achieve an effect.
Right.
It's then had lacquer or some sort of varnish put on top of it.
Yeah.
It has then deteriorated over time in the light. And a good way of looking at this is someone will make some assumption about the tartan, that it's very reddish or whatever. And then you go, yeah, if you look there, all the trees are red as well, or pinkish or whatever. And you can see that either that was a deliberate mood board, if you like, or there has been some fading or discoloration in the portrait. So you have to be very, very careful. Better that it gives you an idea of the colour, so, blue, green, etc. And depending whether the artist is interested in the detail or just the overall appearance, you can get some really good impressions of the tartan. So a very good one in terms of the Black Watch tartan would be the portrait of Johnny Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia, 1760, I think, off the top of my head. And he's wearing a red tartan coat, which is actually Murray of Tullibardine, and you can work out the pattern. And then he's wearing a kilt stroke plaid in the government tartan, Black Watch tartan. And again, you can see the pattern has been accurately recreated.
Mm.
And this tartan is an interesting one because if you know it, you've basically got a blue, green, and black tartan, but on the blue squares, they alternate by having 2 black lines across it and 4 black lines alternating. And so for an artist to recreate that, sometimes they'll just simplify it and just put some stripes on the blue.
Right.
If they're doing it correctly, that gives you an idea of how accurate it is. And then some of them, you can see they've actually put in the selvage mark. So the one of, I can't remember that one, but certainly the portrait of Campbell of Melfort, you can see the selvage mark in it. So a broader black along the bottom, which again gives you an indication that they're painting from life.
Yeah.
Rather than just having a piece of tartan that they've sketched out something in their studio and then say, here's the pattern I'm now going to paint onto this picture.
Yes.
Opposed to saying, I'm sketching what I'm seeing this guy wearing.
Right. Yeah. That's fascinating. That's good. And, that's an excellent artist there that takes the time to identify those details. That's fantastic. Yeah, Dunmore's interesting fellow. I recently actually stayed on the island where he fled, Virginia. So,
Okay.
ironically, it was just the kind of interesting point. We didn't even realize it when we were there. But nonetheless, so you mentioned that there's so much of this Black Watch tartan that was probably produced up until about 1780. Um, how does it just vanish that you can't find any
Well,
of it?
as I say, you look at any clothing. So you'd sort of say there are a whole lot of people, as I say, who stayed with the land grants, particularly some of the 42nd, some of the 78th. Do their uniforms survive? Do their
Hmm.
red coats survive? They don't, because they will have worn them. They will have then taken the braiding off and worn them as a civvy coat until it fell apart. So they will have certainly used, and you see this in Scotland as well. So the pieces of tartan will have been used until they had no use to wear it as a garment, and it will have been, kept in the home as a bed throw or something like that. And then it will have got the moth, or the dog will have eaten half of it. It will end up in the dog bed, etc., etc., etc. But we know that there are fragments and indeed bigger pieces of tartan that survive certainly in Canada, in in the Maritimes, etc., of other different patterns that are sort of contemporary with that. It just beggars belief that at least one piece of the black watch tartan would not have survived, and it's just a case of finding them.
Right.
I was out on PAI a couple of years ago looking at one of the old pieces of MacDonald tartan that was taken there in 1772. And whilst there, I did an interview with CBS, Canadian Broadcasting Service, just putting out there like we're doing now, just trying to elicit some sort of level of interest. And I've had someone write an article for the Quebecois area, in French about this as well. And so far, nothing has turned up. But I'm sure, it's like gold panning. You have to keep turning over stones. And one day, something shiny will turn up. I am absolutely convinced.
Did you come across anything else that was significant in that trip? I mean, was it a worthwhile trip or just getting
And
the
it was
book out
worthwhile,
there?
but it was a fabulous trip to see the original plaid that I had. So this was the MacDonald Glenaladale tartan, which I had reconstructed from photographs of various pieces, probably 10 years before, and had an opportunity to go out for the 200th anniversary of the ship landing that took the people over, 250th actually, sorry. Again, as part of that, I did a series of lectures. So I went up to the Gaelic College, for example, at Antigonish and did a lecture. And people brought various pieces of tartan. Actually, I'd always like to see older ones. And the museum at Antigonish had some lovely old pieces, a couple of which I hadn't seen before, which was great. And then individuals brought pieces that had been woven over there later, so probably early to mid 19th century. And again, it was just interesting to see those pieces. I did have one bite actually as I was leaving for the airport, and someone said, "Oh, I heard you on the radio, and I've got this piece, and it's really interesting. And can you tell me about it?" And I thought I was onto a winner, and he sent me a photograph of a pipe banner
Uh,
that belonged to the Black Watch, and actually much later. And you go, "Oh, that's really interesting. It's not really my area. This is what it is."
right.
So from every false start, hopefully somewhere along the line there'll be a thread that one can pull.
Sure. Over the years, Black Watch, obviously, like you pointed out, has become maybe one of the more popular
Yep.
tartans in the
Yep.
world for various reasons. What are the different change? Has there been many changes over the years with regards to uh its layout or its colors? Like we talked about it being maybe a lighter version early, then it got darker again. Now it's really dark as the government insists that it be a darker shade. What are sort of the
Well, actually,
changes?
that's not quite true now. So the
Oh,
government, in the sense that, so in the late 19th, early 20th century, the military in Britain standardized tartans, had them by numbers. So the black tartan was government number one. The Argyles were the same tartan as government pattern number one alpha. And in that, the green was a lighter bottle shade of green. And that's actually what the Royal Regiment of Scotland now wear. So when that was formed and the regiments amalgamated, they were given one alpha, the Argyll's version of the tartan. And so you see various shades, and different manufacturers will weave it in slightly different shades. It's also important to understand that if you did black watch in old colours, which in terms of the regimental link, if you like, you would never see. However, that tartan, so the actual pattern, is what's worn by the Campbells as the Campbell tartan. It is what's worn by the Sutherlands as their tartan. It is worn by the Grants as a hunting tartan, and the Munros as a hunting tartan. And this is because for those regiments, all those names, all of them commanded companies of the original Highland independent companies, which were regimented to form the Black Watch in 1739. So that's how that connection comes. There's this argument, oh, the Campbells gave their tartan to the Black Watch because there were three Campbell companies. Well, no, there's absolutely no evidence to, to support that. It is much more likely, and there is, some written evidence that a new tartan was created for them when they were formed, as I say, whether it was in 1739 or perhaps slightly later, 40, 42, something like that, I think is a reasonable date for it. And that certainly accords with what the late Jamie Scarlett believed was the definition. The tartan itself is interesting. It's what I would call a plaid set. So that alternating blue squares that have two stripes and four stripes makes it a really big pattern. So in any sort of medium to heavyweight cloth, that gives you a tartan that has about an 11+ inch repeat, which is much bigger than than uh, than traditional woven. So kilts, so modern manufacturers tend to shrink the pattern a bit to make it a sort of about a 7-8 inch set, so
Hmm.
that kiln makers can use it. Um, and then, of course, so if you, as I say, if we're talking about the pattern rather than the name, then you've got it in modern colours, old colours, obviously weathered colours, muted colours, etc. So it's available in all the standard colour ranges by one name or other. So you might get, that tartan in old colours as Campbell, in modern colours as
Hmm.
Black Watch, but it is the same tartan.
Right. Yeah,
A
that's
tartan with
exciting, I
three,
guess.
4 or 5 names. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm
And
looking again, I'm looking back at that picture that you have of the one from 1795.
mhm.
Where did this sample come from that was in on display here to this at the Museum of Scotland?
So that's in the that photograph is from Fort George, and it's part of the display of the what they call the Seafield collection, and it's associated with the Strathspey Highlanders, who were the 97th Strathspey Highlanders. So they wore that tartan, and it came out from the bottom of a knapsack
Oh,
from one of those. We know when the regiment existed, hence how I'm able to date that. And that piece, I've recently had the opportunity to examine it because it disappeared, uh, was mislaid by Historic Scotland for quite a long time. And it's now gone back to the National Museum of Scotland. They've been gifted it. And so I was able to go and examine it there.
okay. Fascinating. So yeah, that was almost a big loss, it sounds like on that one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Given that that is the oldest surviving piece,
Yes.
I've got a
Yes.
piece from about 1820, something like that. It's again very, very similar, but yeah.
So what makes a tartan then become so popular, I guess? So, because it's interesting again with Black Watch, what you often hear is that some people they think maybe you shouldn't wear it because it's a military tartan and so on. But yet it becomes one of those tartans that's everywhere.
Yeah.
How does that happen? And seems like sort of an oxymoron that people are worried about wearing it and yet it's the one that's most
Well, of
widely
course,
everywhere.
people are applying modern um, concerns or idiosyncrasies to something that is much older. So they're applying a modern set of values to something that they didn't apply to at the time that it was popular, if I say. So where it reaches popularity, if you like, along with Royal Stewart, in fact, is through Wilsons of Bannockburn, the great tartan weavers. In the early 1800s, it was one of their popular fashion patterns. It was popular because the military was popular at that time. Think of Waterloo and all that sort of stuff. And it was a favourite stock pattern. And they wove it in all sorts of sizes. So they wove what they called smallest 42nds. So I talked earlier about having the 2 bar, 4 bar stripe arrangement on the navy blue. Well, Wilson's, to make the pattern smaller so that they could use it for ladies' clothing, etc., put just 2 stripes on every blue, which therefore makes the pattern half the size. And
Yeah,
they called that their smallest 42nds. So that was never ever used by the regiment, but they still called it 42nd. They weren't calling it Black Watch at that time.
interesting.
And there are so the Coburn collection, which is 1816, 1820, something like that, more like 1820, has 4 specimens in there, and they are named, I think I'm right off my head, Campbell, Sutherland, Grant, and Munro. Uh,
Hunting.
so again, it just shows that different people were using it at that time. It's when at the point when names were only beginning to become, if you like, regularized or stabilized against certain patterns. But that one, as I say, because of the military association, because of Waterloo and various other things, everybody wanted to show their support and their patriotism, and so it took on a fashion pattern, and that's where it changes from being a military tartan only used by the military to also being then available in if you like public domain, and that would be you could make a similar if you like connection with something like, well, think of the rampant lion flag.
Yeah.
It's a sort of slight parallel, but that theoretically is was not theoretically, that is the flag of the sovereign or the sovereign's representative, should only be flown when the sovereign or their representative is in office, in a position doing something or other. But people fly it off their house Well, actually, that's quite wrong. If they want to fly the Scottish flag, it's the saltire, but it's where it's taken off from what it originally was and become more widely adopted. So there's a sort of parallel with what we're talking about here with the tartan. As I say, people say they shouldn't wear it because it's a military tartan. Well, it's only a military tartan if you call it Black Watch, but if you call it Campbell, then it's not a military tartan. Or if you call it Sutherland, well, that arguably is a military tartan, except it's also then been adopted by the clan. Or you can call it Grant, or you can call it Monroe. In a sort of blue and grey and green version, it was called Ancient Universal. And that's how we get this idea that, well, it's for everybody. And I think nowadays we must accept that it is, if you like, a Scotland's gift to the world almost, that it is a universal tartan that can and is used by everybody. And I guess the difference would be if you were having a kilt that was made to look like a military kilt for a particular regiment, that's where some people might feel a little uncomfortable because you might be purporting that you were somehow connected to that regiment. That said, you can buy a second-hand Black Watch kilt or a Sutherland, Southern kilt, etc., on eBay, on the internet, or somewhere like that, and you're wearing it because you like it. When I was younger, I used to have an old Gordon Highlanders kilt because it was nice and heavy and great for the winter. But I've never served in the Gordons. People can get quite precious about certain aspects of tartan. And dare I say, it is often the case in North America where people are further removed from the history and the traditions.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So people are learning about Black Watch. They like you pointed out, there's so many different maybe titles or names to them. You mentioned Campbell, Sutherland, Grant, Monroe. What are the different tartans then that come from Black Watch? Black Watch is sort of the foundation for a number of different clans tartans, right?
Yeah, yeah, quite a lot. So in the military or quasi-military world, and I once wove a length of this, and to my chagrin, I cut it up into individual pieces, which I wish I hadn't done, and to put in their sample books. But I wove a length, and I changed so the stripe that goes across the green in Black Watch is black. But I wove a length, and I just changed the colour of that every time. So if you change that stripe to white, it becomes Lamont. If you change it to yellow, it becomes Gordon. If you change it to red, it becomes Murray. If you change it to blue and add another blue, it becomes Cheap of Torrensey. If you make it red and then add in a white stripe between the two lines of blue, you get Mackenzie. And so you start to get these variations. If you then have the white stripe but put guards on it, it becomes Lamont. And so there are quite a lot of the basis because a lot of our tartans, our clan tartans, etc., developed from the really the mid 1800s. The Black Watch was a good starting or foundation tartan for a lot of those, and Wilson's Bannockburn certainly did a lot. And one of the two or three they went into rewrite red versions. Started actually with the military, so the Black Watch regiment adopted a red version in which the black was made red. This is what black with red, and
Yeah.
that was worn by the musicians, so the band, and indeed some pipers. And we're talking really sort of 1830 through to about 1850. Also worn by the bandsmen of the 93rd, the Sutherlands. So that you might call that a red version, or it's called the music tartan, or it was called the music tartan by the Black Watch and Wilson's Bannockburn. But the McNab tartan is the Black Watch tartan in two shades of red and green. The one of the McLaughlin tartans is the Black Watch tartan in red, black, and blue. So you start to see those differences where you're changing one of the colours completely and going off in a completely different track, but it is still the same basis. And then you see countless other tartans where you can see elements of the Black Watch in it.
That's really cool. And that does make Black Watch a really special tartan. So let's say, for instance, you find your Holy Grail. Somebody
Yeah,
calls you up and they say, "Hey, we've identified it. We're sure this is what it is. Will you please come look at it?" What does Peter MacDonald do?
get on the first plane. So I would want to verify it. So I can do an awful lot from a good high res photograph in terms of working out the pattern. You should put a color chart against it, put a measure against it, so I can do some measurements. verify what it is. I would love to actually see the thing in person, but as I can do a lot of things. But I would be looking at establishing as I say, the colours we know, red, blue, and black, but the shades that are involved, the size of the pattern, so you can work out the density and roughly what size the pattern was. Um, Look at that and see how that compares, for example, with what Wilsons of Bannockburn were doing in the later 18th century. So they had different settings for officers' weight cloth, sergeants' cloth, soldiers' cloth, but actually it was to do with different weights of cloth. When you looked at the pattern, it was all about the same size because of
Mm.
how it worked out. So to see, how that works out, to see, as I said earlier, if we've got a selvage and which selvage that is. So these early these early plaids were made by joining two pieces of cloth, and to do that, you what they call offset the pattern. So you'd have the one edge would be the pivot, the middle of one of the blue squares, so that when you joined it, the pattern repeated. And on the other side, you would have a selvage mark, which was an extended black, possibly with a light blue at the end of it, and whether that was then herringboned or not. So the size of the selvage mark, confirming where it was, and from paintings you can see it should be how it should be, confirming whether that was herringboned or plain weave as in twill weave, or indeed chevron weave, which I'm just looking at a piece at the moment of something else, which is chevron weave, which is interesting.
Mm.
Um, so confirming all of those sort of things, and then what I would love to do is a reconstruction. A lot of people have said to me, "Well, will you do a reconstruction of the Duffman Blackwash tartan?" And they've pointed to the piece from 1795. But for me, I mean, that's a classic Wilson's Bannockburn piece, which is fine. Yes, you can do that, but actually to go back to an older piece that would have been rurally produced, that is my holy grail. That's what I want to do. There is an interesting piece that's on the back of a waistcoat, a military waistcoat in Edinburgh Castle, that's associated with the Strathspey Fencibles, so not the 92nd Strathspey Highlanders, but the Fencible Regiment, so the local militia, for want of a better word, dated 1797, I think it is. Um, and this, they have obviously repurposed a section of old plaid. And this tartan, there's a paper on it. It's sometimes called the Sutherland tartan, incorrectly. Sorry, Strathspey tartan, but it's not. But this is, if you like, a simplified version of government tartan. Each blue square has 3 black stripes on it, but you can see some herringbone selvaging in it. It is quite clearly an older piece than the style of the waistcoat, so it's been repurposed. So it's clearly a section of an old plaid. It's not been tested, but I'd be fascinated to know, actually, if they were to test it, whether we could carbon date that to, say, the middle of the 18th century or something like that, and whether that actually might be an example of an early piece. So I've certainly matched the colours, etc. It's quite vibrant. There's a paper on it on my website. And it may be that because it's almost government tartan as we understand it, or Blackwatch tartan, it may have just been, one of the local variations. Again, as I say, if you go out to 30 to 100 weavers and say, weave me this tartan,
Yeah.
if you look going back to the early formation of the Blackwatch Regiment and General Wade issuing orders that the plaids should be as close as possible of the same sort and colour,
Mm.
which some people have said, look, that means they're all the same. Or with my military background hat on, it's the quartermaster saying, okay, chaps, can we all roughly look the same? Can we all sort of turn up looking pretty much the same sort of thing? Okay, you've got non-issue boots on, but at least you can wear black non-issue boots as opposed to pink ones, that sort of thing. And this could actually be such a plaid. That's a really interesting thing. I say I've been fortunate to examine it, but I would love to have that piece carbon dated, because that would really tell us something. But it's in the National Collection of the National Museum, and they're reluctant to do things like that, unfortunately, because it means cutting a couple of threads out from somewhere.
So what would it take to get that accomplished then?
Um, Probably an act of God, because it's a bit like going to the Smithsonian saying, okay, so you've got this battle flag, let's say from Custer's Last Stand, and I want to cut an inch out of it and burn it and measure the carbon. It's not going to happen, I don't think.
Well, the difference is you'd be getting them somewhere that might add some more maybe more credentials to the piece by
Oh yeah,
understanding what
no,
it is.
absolutely.
So,
And so that's so with my tartan authority hat on, that's what we had to do with the Glenafric tartan, which is we had to take an inch out of it, and it was only a relatively small piece,
mm,
something like what 14 inches by 10 or something like that.
mm,
We took an inch out of it in order to carbon 14 test it, which means destroying that piece to burn it and measure the carbon.
sure.
But because it was, if you like, a fragment, we could take that off and, if you like, justify doing that. When
Yes.
you've got something that's sewn into a garment completely, unless you're going to open the seams at the back and take a section that can't be seen, which would be the way to do it, I can't see them accepting actually damaging something like that, particularly something like the National Museum, because they have such a reputation, and it's not like it's broken already, so let's just take a broken bit off and destroy it. For
Right.
them, it's an integral piece. So unfortunately, I don't think that will happen, and one can therefore only speculate.
Have you asked?
No, I haven't
Okay.
asked.
Okay. I was just curious if you ever just threw it out there like, hey, everybody, we're thinking this.
Yeah. Can I have an inch of this so that we can get it out? You can't come down with my scissors.
Well, well, maybe they would let you. I don't know. We could
I
ask.
think I know the answer before I ask.
Maybe you could even offer to replace it with something similar. So, but you
Right.
never know, I guess.
But as I say, in terms of possibilities, in terms of colour and weight of cloth, etc., that's an interesting potential, not as much option, but gives you, if you like, something of a potentially parallel period in time. I can quite easily see the material it's made from at the back could easily be mid 18th century,
Mm.
and therefore it is contemporary with French Indian Wars, etc., etc. So if not a Black Watch stroke Fraser plaid or something like that, it may well have been something used by the military at that person, kept in a family, and then repurposed. When young Johnny Grant or whatever needed a backing to his waistcoat. Who knows? Because we don't know who it belonged to, and therefore why that family will have chosen to have that cloth put in the back.
You've gone to great lengths to find this piece. You still haven't found it yet, but the search continues. Now, let me ask you this then. Indiana Jones, his famous comment is whenever he finds a great piece is it belongs in a museum. What would be the thing for you if Joe Blow off the street had the piece, he gives it to you? What are we doing? What do we do with this piece? Is it you're going to reproduce it, of course. It has
Yeah,
to go to a museum, right?
it does. It does. And I guess it would depend on where what the source of it was. So whether, for example, it was someone who had been in the Black Watch, or whether it was say a Fraser's Highlander,
Yeah.
quite different groups. So if it were a Black Watch, definite Black Watch associated piece, I would say it should probably go to the Black Watch Museum in Perth,
Mm.
because that's the regimental museum and home. Um, a lot of their records were burnt or lost at sea, etc., in the 1770s. So the oldest piece of tartan they have is a kilt from the Crimea War. So it would be a fabulous piece for them.
Sure.
If it were associated with some other regiment, or you couldn't necessarily identify it, then the Tartans Authority would be a place. The National War Museum in Edinburgh, which is part of the National Museum of Scotland, would probably be the logical place for it. Yeah,
Got it. Well, Peter, that's a fascinating topic. We look forward to digging deeper into another tartan or two next time, but we appreciate your time.
pleasure. Enjoyed it. And spread the gospel and help me find that piece.
We will spread the gospel of the Black Watch tartan.